Alright, this is the second video graphing absolute value functions. If you remember from the first one, when we graph absolute value, we want to make out an XY table. Okay? And recall from the first video that the first number we choose, we want to choose what makes inside the absolute value 0. Now, a lot of people want to pick -2. But if we pick -2, that's not going to make inside the absolute value 0, because if we plug in -2, we would get y equals absolute value of -2 plus 2, which would be 2 plus 2, which equals 4. So -2 is not the first number we want to pick. Remember, it's what makes inside here 0. So the first number we want to pick would be 0. Okay, so we don't want to use that right now. Then we want to pick two numbers larger than 0, so that would be 1 and 2, and we want to pick two numbers smaller than 0. That would be -1 and -2. And then we plug these x values in for y. Plug these x values in for x to get y. So we have y equals absolute value of 0 plus 2, which would be 0 plus 2, which equals 2. And then we have y equals absolute value of 1 plus 2, which equals 1 plus 2, which equals 3. And then we have y equals the absolute value of 2 plus 2, which equals 2 plus 2, which equals 4. And then y equals absolute value of -1 plus 2, which equals 1 plus 2, which equals 3. And then y equals absolute value of -2 plus 2, which equals 2 plus 2, which equals 4. Okay, so that's the important thing. The first number makes inside absolute value 0. That's the first number we pick for x. Then we want two numbers larger than that, and then we want two numbers smaller than that. So let's plot our points. We're going to plot the points 0, 2. So I've got 0, 2, and then I'm going to plot the point 1, 3 and 2, 4. So I'm going to plot 1, 3 and 2, 4, and then I'm going to plot the point -1, 2 and -1, 3 and -2, 4. So I've got -1, 2 and -2, 4. And there's my graph. Let's take a look at another example. We have y equals absolute value of x plus 2 minus 3. So I'm going to fill out my xy table. Okay, and the first number that I choose is what makes inside the absolute value, what makes that 0. Okay, and of course this is easy. This is just -2, but if you have something a little more complicated in here, you can just take the x plus 2, set it equal to 0, and so that would give you x equal -2. So that's the first number I want to choose, -2. Then I want to pick two numbers larger than -2, so that could be what? -1 and 0, and then two numbers larger. This is two numbers larger than -2. Then I want to pick two numbers smaller than -2. So that's going to be -3, and -4. Okay, so first number we pick, what makes inside the absolute value 0, then we pick two numbers larger, and then we pick two numbers smaller. So now I get my y values, so I get y equals absolute value of -2 plus 2 minus 3, which would be the absolute value of 0 minus 3, which is 0 minus 3, which equals -3. Okay. And then I get y equals absolute value of -1 plus 2 minus 3, which equals absolute value of 1 minus 3, which is 1 minus 3, which equals -2. And then we plug the other x values in, and when we plug 0 in, we would get -1. We plug -3 in, we get -2. -3 plus 2 is -1. Absolute value of -1 is 1. 1 minus 3 is -2. And then we plug -4 in, and we would get -1 as an answer. So now I want to plot these points. So I'm going to plot the point -2, -3. So I've got -2, -3. And then I plot -1, -2, -1, -2, and I plot the point 0, -1. So I got 0, -1. And then I'm going to plot the point -3, -2, and -4, -1. So -3, -2, and -4, -1. And I connect the points. And there's my graph. And let's look at this last one. I've got y equals -x minus 5. So I'm going to do my xy table, and I need to choose some values for x. So the first one I choose, what makes inside the absolute value 0? Well, we can see here that would be a +5. Then I pick two numbers larger and two numbers smaller, and then I plug these in. I get y equals negative absolute value 5 minus 5 equals the negative absolute value of 0, which equals 0. And then y equals negative absolute value 6 minus 5, which equals negative absolute value of 1, which is -1. Y equals negative absolute value 7 minus 5, which is negative absolute value of 2, which is -2. And then y equals negative absolute value of 3 minus 5, which equals negative absolute value of -2. Absolute value of -2 is +2, and there's my negative sign in front. And then y equals negative absolute value of 4 minus 5, which equals negative absolute value of -1, which would give me -1. So I plot my points 5, 0. So I've got 5, 0. And then I plot 6, -1, 7, -2, 6, -1, 7, -2. And then I plot the point 3, -2, and 4, -1. So 3, -2, and 4, -1. I connect the points, and there's my graph. So just remember, when you're graphing absolute value, you want to pick the first x value you pick. You have your xy table. The first value you pick is what makes inside absolute value 0. And then the next two x values you pick, you want to pick two numbers larger, and then the next two you want to pick two numbers smaller. Okay, and I mean, you can pick the two numbers smaller and then the two numbers larger, that doesn't matter. But the first makes inside the absolute value 0, and then you want to pick two numbers larger than that number and two numbers smaller than that number. I hope this helps. Thanks.